Okay, so we are ready to start. Welcome everybody to this last breakout session of the first day of the Hili Forum. I am very pleased to be joined here at this table by lots of prominent experts from all over the world. We have with us Dr. Albadr Alshateri, who is with the National Defense College here in the UAE. We have next to him Dr. Jens Pohl, who is joining us from the Helsinki Geoeconomics School in Finland. We have next to him Creon Butler from Chatham House in the UK, and we have another part of the Global South represented here with Salman, who is with the World Bank, originally Indian, hence the Global South connection, and also an AGDA collaborator of ours here in Abu Dhabi. The title of our session is Radical Restructuring, and we'll talk about tariffs, decoupling, and the future trends. So what we're going to do is try to keep this very conversational, and we would also love to involve our audience as well. You have on that screen a QR code to scan in order to send us your questions. They will show here in front of me, and we'll be able to use them in the Q&A part of the end of our discussion session. So to start things up, I would like to ask every one of my esteemed panelists to very quickly, in just a couple of minutes, tell us, in this framework of turmoil, of disruption, of all sorts of new things that we are facing in the trade arena, what in this current turmoil, in your opinion, is the most important or biggest challenge that we're facing? Dr. Albadr.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm happy and glad to be among a distinguished scholar. I come from political economy, so I'm going to answer from a political economy perspective. As you all know, the underlying structure of the international system, or the international liberal system, was launched basically by the United States, and the United States undergirded this system for a long time. Now what we have the most pressing is this structure is corroding, especially that the United States is retreating to more protectionist and nationalist sort of economic policy. Now remember, when the United States withdrew from Bretton Woods, the dollar is still maintained. Why? Because there was a social capital that has been built in the preceding for decades, and then the dollar is still remained the preferred currency of exchange. Because why people did trust the system even after the withdrawal of the United States. Today, I think that social capital is evaporating before our own eyes. People are not trusting this system anymore. The global hegemony that was established, whether it's the 19th century Britain or the US, was about enlightened self-interest, that those global hegemons, obviously they will serve themselves, but at the same time also prosperity will spread throughout the world, and this will be good for the US or Britain and good for the whole world. Now this is changing with the new administration and the new policy that I'll just end with this because I remember reading this a long time ago by Stephen Krasner, who was one of the leading political economists, and he said that throughout history, rising hegemons want to protect free trade. Declining hegemons usually go to protectionists. So it's true then, and I think it's true now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So for you, it's the eroding social capital that is the biggest challenge that we're facing right now, and the move towards protectionism. Dr. Jens, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Damiana. And Thank you, co-panelists and everyone in this room. First of all, as I said to you, Dr. Damiana, in private, this is an amazing event, and it's fantastic that you're bringing geopolitics, geoeconomics, and geotechnology into an integrated two-day conference. I think this is well overdue and a very, very strategic place to have this conversation. So what I can bring to the table is the perspective of corporate geoeconomics, which when we talk about geoeconomics is not always the most heard voice. But what corporate geoeconomics is to expand the logic of geoeconomics, but doing so from the perspective of those who actually run the economy. So that's private enterprise and capital at risk. The conversation otherwise is very state-centric. And of course, those perspectives are also very important. But in order to have a strong economy, or to be strong as a geoeconomic power and have a strong economy, you also have to be accommodated to your private enterprise and your capital at risk that's generated or attracted to your country. So what are the major challenges? Well, there are lots of candidates, right? One can think of the situation of a declining hegemon. It's a challenge. It's not necessarily a bad thing, because that's why I see it. If one hegemon declines, it's also the empowerment of other countries. So, but on the other hand, such a tectonic shift will necessarily have major implications that we can't entirely control. So that's the challenge. It's handling the fallout of a balancing of powers between different countries. There's nothing inherently malign about that at all. But it's a major shift, and no one is completely in control of it. I would still single out something much more fundamental as the main challenge, and that's what I call the geo-intellectual awakening that we are faced with. But because many of our base assumptions need to be questioned and re-examined. The world order that we want to preserve, let's face it, was never entirely universal. It was universal in application, but there is no such thing as an understanding that is not more or less influenced by different powers or partners. So in crafting a world order like the one that was established after World War II, it's natural that the voice of the United States would be the loudest voice heard, and they created a framework which was very amenable to United States interests. And again, there's nothing malign about that, but we also need to recognize it. And so when the world order now needs to adapt to new realities, it's also quite clear that some of these base assumptions need to be re-examined. So I'll leave it there, but we'll probably come back to some of these questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. May we just finish the table and we'll get back to comments. Creon.
No.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the organisers for inviting me to this fantastic event, and also to my fellow panelists. So I think the biggest challenge the world is facing is the uncertainty created by the Trump tariff shock. And I mean, a lot of the discussion today has kind of rather diplomatically talked about general turbulence. In fact, it's turbulence that very much roots to the US. While other countries certainly have problems with the world trading system, they, I think, would have addressed those problems through a gradual process of reform. It's the US that has come in and basically, from its own perspective, effectively withdrawn from a very substantial part of the system. And I think you can look at the uncertainty in two respects. One is the inherent uncertainty in the US policy itself. So it's, as I said, withdrawn from compliance with WTO rules. It's also actually ignored some 20 bilateral free trade agreements, including with countries in this region. In the reciprocal tariffs, it's an incredibly simplistic approach to setting tariffs. I mean, if the objective, even if it is to reduce the overall US trade deficit, to actually focus on individual countries and only goods, not services, really makes no economic sense. They have political goals as well as economic goals. You know, you can see that in Trump's approach to Brazil and India. And it's not clear when it's going to end. So you can see Trump's threats towards the European Union in relation to tech regulation. And then you also have within the US the legal uncertainty, because one set of tariffs has been declared by one court as illegal, and you also have the uncertainty from the upcoming midterm elections next year as to whether, if there's a shift in Congress, whether that will put constraints. And that's just within the US. If you look at it from the wider world, you also have the uncertainty in how countries are responding. Now, many countries, particularly if they don't have much negotiating power, have essentially gone for the best deal that they can achieve. I think you could put the UK in that category. The EU, which is certainly big enough to retaliate and seek a better deal, actually decided not to at the end. And I think, although they've been heavily criticized for that, I think you can relate to the security situation they're in and the priority they've given to Ukraine. China still is standing out there and saying, we're going to be tough on this. The average tariff rate has moved from like 2.5% average tariff rate in the US last year to something like just over 18% now so far. It may go up further. But you can't even say there's an average rate of tariff rate of 18% because each country, each sector has something different. And then just finally, I very much like the kind of analogy with the dollar shock. I think one of the Nixon shock and the withdrawal of the US from the fixed exchange rate system. One difference now is there was not in Nixon's approach the threat to the security relationship with its closest allies. By contrast, Trump has threatened the territorial integrity of Canada and of the EU through his comments on Greenland. So that puts this whole kind of context of a trade dispute in a very different perspective. So I think it's uncertainty more than anything that is the challenge we have to face. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Creon. Salman.
Thank you. Thank you, Damiana. Thank you to ECSR and AGDA for inviting me. Now, we're here talking about trade and this radical restructuring, but the question really is, why are we here? And the reason we are here is because trade has become an extremely important aspect of the global economy. In 1960, the global economy was about $1.5 trillion, and right now it's about $110 trillion. But global trade at in the 1960s, early 1960s, was less than $500 billion, and it is now about $60 trillion. So as a share of the global economy, trade is now, has gone from 20% to about 60%. So it's a massive, massive shift. No country, zero, in the last 5 decades has become an advanced economy without trade. There's not one example in the world that we see of prosperity coming to you without trade. So this is obviously of extreme importance to so many around the world. Billions have been lifted out of poverty because of obviously contributions from trade. So this is a huge, huge deal. But trade was slowing down. I know we're talking about President Trump's tariffs right now, and I think that's fair, but trade has been slowing down. In fact, trade is pretty much flat since the global financial crisis of 2008. And what happened, of course, there are many, many reasons for this. The Doha round stalled. Protectionism has grown. In fact, we focus a lot on this tariff shock right now. What many people don't talk about is that we've had almost 3,500 protectionist actions, which are not tariff, they're non-tariff and other things like export controls, etc., that have happened since the global financial crisis. My own country, India, has become very protectionist since 2018, especially, and India among the G20 economies has the highest tariff rates, average tariff rates. So what President Trump has done is basically brought into sharp focus what is already happening in the world. So the world was already becoming much more protectionist, and the G20 economies, the largest economies of the world, they're primarily responsible in some ways for this protectionism, and I think to their own disadvantage, to my mind. Now, what has President Trump done? He's basically created a lot of, I agree with you, he's created a lot of uncertainty in the system. He's basically taken a hammer and basically hit a weakened kind of edifice. So now the question for us is, what does this all mean? To my mind, the danger here is not just that there is uncertainty, and uncertainty could be only for a little bit, right? If you're patient, maybe things will improve. Maybe if you're patient for another few years, there'll be a new administration, things could change. But that may or may not happen. The problem is, it's not just about the US, it's also about what other countries are going to do. Now imagine you're a big country, say like China, and you're selling $600 billion worth of things to America. That channel seems to be clogged up. The Indian channel seems to be clogged up. Where is all that going? Where is all that product going to go? So I think we focus a lot on America. We have to focus on the world, because then only will we see the true big picture. Because right now, I think, of course, America's trade as a share of its economy is very limited. And even as a share of global trade, it's about, I guess, 10, 15%. But we really have to think big picture. And the other issue that I really worry about as a world banker, I guess, I'm a consultant there, but a long-time world banker for 3 decades, is what happens to the poorest countries who have no defenses whatsoever. I think those countries are going to suffer a lot. And I think this is an opportunity for other countries to step up, including for my now home of UAE, to establish relationships, help out countries as much as possible. And then, of course, we have to talk about what countries can do, and we will get to that. But this is the uncertainty that President Trump's tariffs have unleashed could easily, to my mind, progress towards far worse things than just economic conflict. And I think we have to be very careful about that.
Thank you. We're not painting a pretty pink picture here. Nothing is rosy, it seems. But Dr. Badr wanted to jump in and react to something Dr. Jan said.
I agree with all the 3 speakers and what they said. Obviously, this has a security implication. I'm a student of international relations, and I think trade helped, in a sense, stabilize the system. But the importance of the U.S., while we concentrate on the U.S., is the U.S. is the only one capable and willing to produce international public goods. I don't see any other power has the capability. The United States has about 700 bases or military facility throughout the world. It represents about 25 or more of the world GDP. So it has the extra power than other countries don't have. So my problem is, what I think is, if other countries are unwilling to sort of foot the bill for the international system, and the United States withdraw, then what we are in a trap that might portend a conflict that also happened during the Depression and World War II. Another thing that just was mentioned, by the way, the globalization was good. I wasn't, by the way, praising the system 100%, and I understand very well, because also I'm a student of development. Many countries were left behind. For example, the Global South, which is very important, by the way. Can you imagine during colonialism, the rich country were 3 times richer than a poor country, and then after independence, it became like 30, 35 times richer. Today, with the advent of globalization, they are about 80 times richer. So about $3.5 billion. The possession or material possession of 3.5 billion individuals is less than 80 richest people in the north. I mean, it's just staggering when you see this number. We are fortunate maybe to be born or lived in those countries, but you can just imagine the level of poverty and what are the implications of this in terms of security and the stability of the world. So this is what I wanted just to make the comment to add, which I agree with all the comments.
Absolutely. I think that there's a lot of voices around the world who are asking if and when is China going to step up to what we expect it to do in terms of filling that vacuum that is opening up. And I don't think there's a clear answer to whether the if or to the when question as of now. And if it's not China and if it's not the US anymore, then who could potentially get into that vacuum space? Is the EU ready? Is it there? I know we had questions we talked about, but there's no point in following them, particularly if the discussion is lively enough. Creon, I think you want to answer that.
So thank you. So I think, in a way, although it's not an immediate factor, I mean, countries have suffered from their relationship with China in the past. I mean, different countries have been in subject to sanctions. Australia has been subject to various sanctions because of things that China was unhappy with. So if you're looking for the alternative to the US, it frankly is only the EU, if they choose to do it, that could form the basis for an alternative trading bloc. I mean, in terms of GDP, that's about 18% of world GDP compared with, 25% or so for the US. They have the next biggest reserve currency. They're the largest exporter of manufactured goods in the world. They don't have a security offer in the way that US does, and that's a really strong factor because you could argue security and trade are very closely related. And then there's a whole issue of, do they really want to do it? Can they create the kind of internal unity? Can they deal with issues like the Savings Investments Union and sort of create the internal strengths that are necessary to play that role? And then, in a sense, what do they offer to the world? So the advantage of the EU is they are not threatening in the way that the US is and China is. It doesn't mean that they're, in every aspect the excellent partner. Countries have been very unhappy about some of the things that the EU has done in the past. But they do have a potential there if they choose to do it. And so I think, the question we face is it going to be US or China, or is it US, a bloc around the EU and China that become the pillars of the global economy?
It seems that with the EU, the problem is mostly internal rather than external in terms of the populism that's rising within a lot of European countries that might prevent that kind of ideal policy that you're describing, which would be lovely, but I'm not sure it's about to take place, at least not with the current government in place in certain economies over there.
I mean, very quickly, you have populist threats in particularly three major countries, France, Germany, and possibly even the UK as well. I think, it's going to play out over the next few years exactly how that works out. Just speaking from my own country, in the UK, you have a government that is, I would argue, although it's pretty unpopular, it is generally trying to solve real problems in the way that for, 10 years or so, we've not had a government that's sought to do that. Now, whether they will get the credit from the public for doing that remains to be seen. And I think you have similar issues in both Germany and France and some of the other EU, other European countries alongside the UK.
Thank you. Salman, can we take a look at the strategies that countries could potentially use to mitigate all of this fallout of protracted trade conflict? If it had been something very temporary, we wouldn't be worried about it, but it seems like it's going to take a little longer than many of us wanted to and many countries wanted to. So what can countries do in that context?
Well, you did say that this is a little dismal, but I'll try and have some positive things to say as well. Well, first of all, I think this is not the time for countries to panic. My sense is that we have to be a lot more calm about this, and I think there's a lot of noise right now, and things are happening. I mean, for example, in India, we've lost hundreds of thousands of jobs in textiles, in leather, in other places where there are steep tariffs right now. And the problem is that the private sector, companies, if you shut down, it's hard to get them back up. So that's a serious concern. But countries as a whole, you can do things collectively, and then there are certain things that countries have to do by themselves. Collectively, one thing I would suggest to countries is that we not lose sight of the fact that the WTO framework came up with a lot of hard work over many decades. And, it's like you're in love with somebody. And then when you're in the relationship, you say, oh, maybe it's not that great. But when you lose that relationship, then you start missing that person. So the WTO, I think, as an organizing principle, to my mind, countries should not lose sight of that. But I think multilateralism is not dead, to my mind. I think it is just changing shape. You have lots of multilateral kind of initiatives. You have, all sorts of trading blocs that we already have. The EU has its own. There's ASEAN. There's, the TPP or the successor, the RCEP. There are many such initiatives. There's the African one as well, where work is going on, and those things should happen. Those things should continue, and and strengthen till you find a truly global kind of framework. You have to continue these things. I think the UAE is also pursuing a lot of these relationships now. But countries also have to look at what's happening to their economies, and I think there some corrective action has to be taken. If your export industries are suffering badly, and there is danger or imminent danger of job losses, etc., you have to have social protection policies in place.
Absolutely, the risk is very, very real. And thank you for the lovely introduction to the next question, which is on the regional trade agreement. And we see more and more of them. The UAE has signed a myriad of free trade agreements in the last 3 years. We have almost 10 of them already now ratified and in place, but there are negotiations at different stages with probably another 20 countries or blocks of countries, including with the EU, etc. So what is that bringing to the global trade architecture? Is that going to be a permanent fixture of that future? Dr. Jens, would you like to pitch in?
I should probably not go first because I believe what I'm going to say will not be what you normally hear. But okay, I think it's a laudable thing. The EU has always pushed for free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties and so forth. It's what we have in our DNA, so to say. But precisely as we pointed out in the beginning of this session, we are at the sort of, in a sense, we have maybe past peak globalization in some respects, where we trade a lot more with the rest of the world than we ever did before. But we're also, in a sense, at peak legalization of international relations. If you look at it historically, it's never been the case before that the relation between different nations are to the extent of today, detailed, regulated in detail, and we have various types of dispute settlement mechanisms for it. It's difficult to argue against the wisdom of doing that. On the other hand, though, when we did that in an environment where there was a hegemon that upheld an international legal order, that was one thing. But we need to understand, and this is the sort of the geo-intellectual challenge we need to understand, that we are not there anymore since several years. Some people talk about multipolarity. I think we're not even there. We are in apolarity right now. There is really no pole. And maybe we're moving towards a stable multipolar system, but there's nothing stable about it right now. And so without might, there is really no right. Rights without might, well, that's an unenforceable claim. And that's going to be very, very problematic. And as long as nobody knows that the emperor is naked, that's fine. But sooner or later, all of these rights without any proper enforcement mechanism is going to deflate even the concept of law, and that I think is very dangerous. And so is it meaningful or not? Well, yes, but we need to slowly adapt our thinking about regional trade agreements. A world where we assume sovereign equality is a world that has some form of enforcement mechanism, because states are not equally powerful. It's a blatant truth that we need to realize. And then they're strong, and then they're weak. And so how do we do it? How do we manage it if we're not one of the big ones? Well, we have to collaborate with each other, obviously, and we need to be more circumspect with whom we do it. So during the era of U.S. hegemony, multilateralism was the rule. Everybody was coming along. This doesn't quite work in a world where you have to actually think through what kind of enforcement power do we have, what kind of coercive, what choke points do we command, in what dependencies could we weaponize. So you need to rethink that. You need to think about who is a good match with us. And I think that this initiative that the UAE signed with Singapore, that's not TTIP, it's FITP, right? And I think that's a step in the right direction. That it's a sort of obviously it's thoughtful collection of small open economies. It's not a random selection. And I think that's one interesting way of looking at it. Another possible model for collaboration, because collaboration I'm convinced will continue. I'm not saying anything else, but there will be other models. And the other interesting model is the AUKUS model, although it has a very specific theme, and that is basically the Australia, United Kingdom and US collaboration around submarines. But it's interesting, not only the fact that they're collaborating, but the fact that they're organizing it not as some sprawling, all-inclusive club. It's very different if you look at the products of early multilateralism in the 1940s and 50s, the EU or the EEC, and the United Nations. It's a big assembly of states versus AUKUS, which has a hub and spoke setup. So I think that's more what we're going to have to look at. We'll look under the hood and understand what is the enforcement mechanism around it. And that might be result in unbalanced treaties. It might be even unfair treaties. So not all treaties are good treaties. You have to be very careful with whom you're dealing with. But the abstract notion of a universal common good is for the time being suspended. And we need to look out for communities of interest and, as I said, rights that you can actually enforce. But we are still left with another problem, and that is, if we're talking about RTAs, regional trade agreements, we are in peak globalization, as we said, and every region is very integrated with other regions. So we don't have strategic autonomy in any particular region. So if we want to have some useful constellation of collaboration, we need to do as the UAE and Singapore collaboration, which is global. It's not limited to a region. So that's some of my thoughts there. Happy to elaborate if you wish.
Thank you very much. I think Creon wants to react.
Thanks very much. Well, I think I agree with the analysis. I'm not sure if I came out in the same place in the conclusion, in the sense that you're absolutely right that the legal certainty that previously the WTO, now regional trade agreements provide is kind of essential to business and to underpinning prosperity. So I think one possibility is that, especially if efforts to relaunch the WTO as an overarching system don't work, although those efforts are underway, but if they don't work, then the other approach is basically through an intensification of free trade agreements, but traditional free trade agreements with strong legal underpinnings, with if you like, an overarching system. I mean, there is a WTO requirement in terms of free trade agreements only at least covering 90% of all the trade among the member countries. So that could be a way in which, if you like, we restore a global trading system. But it may be a global trading system that is around the US. So the US is kind of there in the middle with its 20% tariff rate. And then you have a kind of donut of a trading system around it, which is perhaps rebuilt through the free trade agreements. And as you say, there are a whole plethora. You've cited many that have developed with GCC countries, but you have the UK, India, you have EU, Mercosur. There's an enormous number, and there's a real impetus going into that. And indeed, some of the speakers, I think the Indian speaker earlier was saying that one of India's responses to Trump's approach is to look for other trading partners. I think the final thing I'd just say is I don't think Trump's approach generates anything of this kind. Sadly, I mean, I think the EU was hoping that when the US said, okay, we're threatening such and such tariffs, they could end up with, if you like, a zero tariff industrial goods deal. And, in a way you could tip it around and you end up with something better than you had before. President Trump just wasn't interested in that. He wants a significant tariff rate to raise revenue within the US. Plus, as we saw with the successor to NAFTA, which Trump himself negotiated, he doesn't necessarily respect a free trade agreement as something that is there permanent to last. It's something that could be turned around, if he feels that it's necessary. So I actually think if this development happens, it's for the rest of the world around the US rather than something that US, at least under the present under the current president would participate in. And if I might finally say, I think one of the most interesting sort of global developments is if CPTPP and the EU actually develop a closer relationship. In a way, you begin there to have a safety net, effectively, for the collapse of the WTO, because it involves so many countries across the whole world. Thank you.
Dr. Albadr.
Yeah, I just want to add to the discussion regarding when systems decline, states, firms, or organizations. You remember the Albert Hirschman saying that either people will voice or exit or stay loyal. So either they will protest or they exit from the system, or they will remain loyal. In this case, we see a lot of exit from globalization. We see the rise of regional cooperation, as you have mentioned, and there is some benefit to regional cooperation that we should not facilitate trades. Regional agreement can simply simplify trade process, reduce tariffs, and enhance market access among members. And also it can enhance economic growth among regional agreement, and also in the same way it gives collective bargaining to what you were talking about, what we call international relation, rebalancing against arising or an aggressive in the security terms, but also aggressive economically. What countries will do is rebalance against that country in the security terms. Will that happen in the economic terms? Is more likely. So those are the benefits, but of course there are other benefits that drawbacks that trade agreements tend to exclude other countries, and that's another problem. And also it creates a complexity of agreements, what is called the spaghetti ball, that you will have multiple agreements, and business costs will rise because people will have to meet different, which will lead eventually to trade divergent to different places. Whereas and also there is a problem with when you have cooperation, you have differentiation in terms of benefits to different members. Members can benefit differentially, and then this will influence the coherence. But what I should emphasize is not reinventing WTO, but before we do that, we need another round of trade talks and negotiation to sort of mitigate whatever is coming from Washington, whether Washington will agree or not. But we need those dialogues among different countries, including regional grouping, to facilitate trades among those regional groups if Washington will not come on board on a new dialogue or a new round of trade talks.
As if things were not complicated enough and dismal enough, I just, maybe as an economist, I have to be very, very dismal. But, we're talking about trade, of course, that's the topic. But we have to remember that a related area is investments. And that's a huge area. And investments were growing along with trade for many, many years, for decades, and then things stalled. But we also have to think about America's power to invest, and also knowledge transfer. So I think this trade part is complex enough, but there are many more complications. The other thing that is important to consider is individual circumstances, circumstances of individual countries. When I teach at the Diplomatic Academy, I tell my students that, yes, I talk about averages, but you have to look below the averages to see what's going on. So the Indian speaker in the previous plenary talked about how India is going to look at other countries, they're acting east, etc., and talked about China specifically. And there's been a lot of talk recently about the Indian Prime Minister visiting China, etc., and trying, maybe as leverage against the Americans. But what we have to remember is that India is running a trade deficit of about $100 billion with China right now. $100 billion. And there's not a lot of room for India to take on more of that. In fact, we've been pushing for a rebalancing of that trade. So, but remember again this whole construct of how China has a lot of inventory that it has to, supply to other places. India has to also be careful about that. So it's not that simple for countries to just shift from one supplier or consumer to the other. In fact, when people say that China could easily take the exports that are not going to the US, go somewhere else, who's going to buy those things? Who has the capacity to buy those things at the prices that the American consumer is paying? So, there are lots of intricacies, a lot of details that don't often come up to the surface, but we have to think about them.
Thank you, Salman. Ambassador Kumar is in the room. I think there will be interesting discussions taking place right after. Sorry, couldn't join us at the table right now. But
can I ask him a question? If you allow me, just one question.
Sure.
Very short. I want to know the upshot of this production that is not finding an outlet. Do you anticipate that will be an international debt crisis? Because those companies have to pay for those products. They obviously they didn't raise capital from their company. They borrowed this money, and if they are not selling their goods, then presumably this will be another debt crisis for different regions.
So as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to individual countries who are facing this kind of a situation, say the Indian government is facing this problem right now, tariffs being at 50%, which is, to my mind, totally unjustified, but it is what it is. What are our companies going to do? They cannot sell there, and it's not as if you can just flip a switch and take your exports and ship them elsewhere at the prices that the American consumer was going to pay. So there is a possibility. In fact, it's already happening. We're losing lots of jobs. Companies are shutting down in India. I'm talking about India in particular. Lots of those sectors where which are labor intensive, which is very important to our country. So the government has to step in. There's no, because this is a crisis which is an external shock, nothing to do with producers. So it'll be in the form most likely of either fiscal incentives or subsidies, etc., or it will be in the form of forbearance on loans, on regulations, etc. I'm sure the government is working on it, but there's no choice. And it's not just India. Every country that is affected right now will have to come up with something. If the US is going to use policy to work on trade issues, other countries will have to do that too right now.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's important to recall that, the US is only 30% of world imports, 10% of world exports. So there's an awful lot of trade that goes on that does not involve the US. And I think one of the questions here is, is the rest of the world only going to focus on their individual responses, or will there be a degree of coordination? This is particularly an area, and I think it's particularly focused on China, to what extent, China sees it, the Chinese leadership see it as in their interest not to flood the world market with goods that can't go to the US. Interestingly, you go back to the global financial crisis, arguably China did behave in a way that took account of the global impact of its actions. It remains to be seen whether they will do that now, but if I was in the Chinese position, I would see a strong advantage in not actually further destabilizing the system, but then it requires them to get on top of their domestic exporters, and it also, they have a strategy that switched from the housing sector into boosting manufacturing, and that to a degree requires exports. So I think that remains to be seen. But it does go to this broader issue: is will the world find a way to coordinate, if you like, without the US being a leader in that coordination? And that's the new challenge that we have.
Just very quickly on China. China is so fascinating. China's trade has also declined. As a share of its economy, China's trade is now about 35%, used to be 60%. Now, the other problem for China is that the Chinese economy is slowing down. Long-term projections from the IMF suggest that growth is going to be maybe at under 4%, averaging under 4% over the next 5 years, and under 3% in the 1930s to 1940s that horizon. it is not as if China has, I know many people, many commentators have said that China is going to gain from this and most likely will gain to some extent. But it isn't as if this is an unmitigated great opportunity because China itself is facing headwinds. And even if China wanted to kind of stabilize things, may find that their own economy is not in such a shape that they can just absorb some of the losses to cushion the global economy. So I think this is truly a very fraught moment to my mind.
Thank you very much. We have quite a few questions from the audience. So I think we're going to jump to one of the issues we haven't tackled yet to the very micro level, because we looked at the big picture so far. But I would go back to Dr. Jens and look at the company perspective. What can the poor businesses do in all of this? Because they don't have leverage to decide or negotiate much of the things that are taking place. They mostly suffer from whatever decisions are being taken. So how do you see strategies that they could adopt to make it a little easier on them?
The first issue before going anywhere is to realize the risks. What can happen? Starting with how can companies, how can investors survive before thinking how can they long-term adjust? Because the type of shocks that we are now experiencing and the type of shocks that we can imagine, we started with trade, but there's also investments, and then there are also currencies, and we had this tax almost being introduced, the one big beautiful bill, Section 899, it was a close one. So we have an idea that this is not just going to be limited to trade. So the first thing you need to do is to assess the risks. It involves understanding how your business plan is exposed to the type of shocks that can come your way. So you need to understand what types of shocks come your way, how they impact you, and then try to assess the likelihood of that happening. So the risk aspect comes first. The second aspect is to understand how it impacts your strategy. Maybe there will be some types of economic activity that simply will not be profitable anymore. When just in time is being replaced with just in case, that has cost implications. There are certain things that some businesses used to do that's no longer viable economically. That means that we can expect a lot of mergers and acquisition activity as firms readjust what they do. It also depends on what type of investors they have and what type of return those investors are expecting. So we should definitely expect that firms are reassessing their strategies long term, reassessing the markets in which they are currently involved, diversifying their exposure to different markets, and understand this through the various scenario analysis that they do, what can happen in different scenarios. So that's a little bit just making sure that you can still stay in business. But business is there for profit. So it's not simply enough to say, well, let's shield ourselves and just take a deep breath. That's misunderstanding the problem. It's not, the 1990s is not coming back. And so you just have to understand that the world has become a different place. And in order to make profit in the future, you have to maybe do business in a very different way. That there are opportunities there too. The main opportunity lies in the difference and the balance between efficiency and economic security. So efficiency is a well-known concept. Economics is all about efficiency. It's also a universal concept. What's efficient for me is efficient for you. It's well understood. Economic security is the very opposite. It's a poorly understood concept. We know some of the ingredients, but we don't know, how. We don't know the recipe really. It's also state-specific. Every state will have their view of what's in their economic security interest, and there are very little global coordination on economic security. The other thing is that firms are approaching these two variables in a different way, and that's why it's going to be very difficult to find some kind of stable equilibrium between them. Efficiency is pursued in your own interest. If you're an investor or if you're a company, you do it for your own sake because it leads to profit. Economic security, on the other hand, that's a state's interest. And now it becomes complicated because unlike individuals that belong to one state are captive of one state, transnational firms operate in many, many countries. And you may have your home state, but that doesn't mean that other states that you're operating in will also impose their economic security agenda on you. They will screen your investments no matter where you're from. And so the problem that firms have that operate transnationally is that you have all these states, and everyone wants to meddle in your business on the basis of economic security. So I'll leave it there. But I don't think that we can find a stable. I don't think we can find a stable sort of equilibrium. Firms can spot opportunities because of the discrepancies of the different policies in the countries that they're operating in, and they can profit from those. They can sort of exploit those. On the long term, in order for firms and investors to not be bullied and pushed around, they need to develop power as well. And of course, there are few who can do that, but many others cannot. And I think that what we can see is firms are going to take economic diplomacy much more seriously. It's not something that they can say, well, that's someone else's business, because the government will not extend diplomatic protection to all its firms in all the countries. It's just not doable. Firms have to take this also into their own, in their own sort of on their own responsibility. And if you manage your dependencies intelligently, the firm can actually build power. And I think that that's something that economics also needs to start dealing with, that you sort of minimize your exposure, you minimize your dependencies, but opportunistically build others' dependency on you. And so economics is not there quite yet, but I hope that we, with time, can develop corporate geoeconomics in a way that firms start participating in these changes and are not just victims of it. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one specific question on that, which is about the opportunities for UAE firms from the audience. Do you see any? And if you do, that's for everybody on the table. What can UAE businesses expect to gain from this new circumstance?
That's a bold question, because it goes straight to the opportunities. But I think that the UAE is very well placed compared to many countries in that it's a significant actor in the sovereign investment space. That means that the resources devoted to thinking geoeconomically and to invest geoeconomics is way ahead. At least the potential is there to be way ahead than many others. I think it was. I think it was the Prime Minister of this country who said that you don't have to, you don't have to be the fastest gazelle. You just don't have to be the slowest gazelle, and you don't need to be the slowest lion. So, what I think is important for a country like UAE is to be, ahead of the curve. It's a small country in the broader scheme of things, but already it has a head start when it comes to sovereign investment, and that is actually the thing that is most important in this world. So I think the possibilities are there. Now, how does it play out in detail? Well, that's very firm specific as well. It's very difficult to generalize about.
Can I just say something? Add the political dimension to this. The UAE tends to juggle two balls now, right? Asia and the minister was very clear that that's the way we're going to do. We're going to have a relationship with different countries. And whoever said instead of non-alignments, all alignments, I think it was the Indian Foreign Minister. So this is what the UAE is thinking about. But I think there will come time that countries in the Gulf will have to choose their security guarantor or their economic partners. And I think that will be a problem. When that will be, if things get worse between China and the United States, what will be the choices of smaller power, middle powers like this? So it's not going to be only economic rationale, which is true. What you said is it gives us a space to bargain, but also there is the geopolitical implication.
So, very quickly, I think that is actually it is a problem. But it's also an opportunity, because it is what gives UAE or Emirati economic diplomacy clout. So one should not only see it as on the receiving ends of big power politics, but actually, if wielded well, an opportunity to strike, come to an understanding between the greater powers. Exactly how you do that, it's be above my pay grade, but I do see the potential.
I was just on this topic of what can happen in the UAE, but not just UAE, most countries. I think what I've seen of the UAE is there's been a lot of diversification, of course. Now 75% of the economy is non-hydrocarbon. But I think what I would like to see the UAE do more of is make their products more complex. I think move towards economic complexity, rather than just diversification. Because if you look at the most advanced countries in the world right now, on economic complexity, countries like Singapore, Switzerland, South Korea, they're way ahead. Countries like the UAE and India have to catch up. And I think because that's the future. You know, the future is there. If you want to use this as an opportunity, then use industrial policy, but use it in a very directed fashion, like the Asian tigers did at their time. Don't create a protectionist racket, so to speak, right? You don't want to protect your companies forever. You want them to compete for purpose. And the purpose should be, how can we make more complex products and services and then compete in the world, and for a certain time duration, not forever and ever. I think that would be good for the country, that would be good for the companies out here, for some predictability around those issues.
Thanks. I'm sadly not an expert on UAE, so I can't comment on UAE, but I just wanted to go back to, this is not a good place to be in. You know, a situation where companies are having to make these kind of choices. So, I mean, in the US, yes, some big tech companies have struck a deal directly with the government over their exports of chips to China. Now, okay, that might look like a good thing in the short term, but it can vanish overnight. It can go. Similarly, you know, Ørsted has faced a US action on its major wind farm in the US that seems to be very much politically linked to US president's unhappiness with Denmark over Greenland and so on. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is facing criticism from the US over decisions it's made in relation to investments in Caterpillar, which is linked to its views on Palestine. So, and China has done this as well in relation to Korean and Japanese companies. So, the world this takes us into is one that I think generally is really bad for companies. I mean, to the extent that there is a space in the world where this doesn't happen, I can see this as being attractive for companies for all kinds of reasons, because they don't face that uncertainty. Just very quickly on industrial policy, in case I don't get a chance. I mean, I'm very cautious. I mean, particularly because there's a scope to waste enormous amounts of money on industrial policy. The UK has done that in the past. And, there is an approach which sort of focuses on things that are broadly good for the economy, skills, services, R&D, and then there are things that are very focused on specific industries. We know the first works. Big public investment in public infrastructure works, as does investment in skills. The latter may not work. And so to the extent that you have limited amount of funding, as certainly the case in the UK now, I would go for the former rather than the latter.
Yeah, so I think that one thing that's very important, I think, to understand is that yes, we want to say that things are good or things are bad. This is not going to be good for the world economy. I think we need to do that type of evaluation, but we also need to understand that we also need to have a better understanding of how things actually work, whether we like it or not. And I think that is something that we've sort of had the luxury of not having to think about, because and it goes with the territory of economics, because the underlying assumption is that there is such a thing as a common good. And maybe there is a common good, maybe there isn't. But what's really important is it may not be the top of the agenda of Mr. Trump. So most people make their decisions, whether private individuals, companies or states, out of individual interest. And yes, there is also maybe a tension with common good, but if we're going to navigate the complex world, it's important to understand that the agents out there, the states out there, the companies out there, they will be guided by their understanding, rightly or wrongly, of what they think is in their best interest. So we need to understand things which we don't necessarily like. But coming back to Salman's point, I think that's why I sort of raised my hand. What you call embracing more complexity in the Emirati economy. I first didn't agree, but then I understood what you were thinking about, and I agree with you. But I would say the important thing is to be, if you want to succeed geoeconomically, you need to keep an eye on the 5 C's, the commanding heights of the future, the 5 commanding heights, which are critical technologies, critical infrastructure, critical intelligence, access to data, and access to inputs like raw materials, water, and food, critical inputs. So these 5 are all critical. And I think that, well, the origin of the Emirati economy is really around critical resources through energy, right? But it's already moved on way beyond that. But infrastructure may not only be choke points in the traditional sense of geographical things, but it can also be infrastructure of different kind, including virtual infrastructure. It links back to technology because some dominant technologies become infrastructure. You kind of have to start thinking about the commanding heights. Flip-flops need to be produced, T-shirts need to be produced. Those are not critical. Europe is a superpower in cheese. Well, but cheese is not critical, So, unfortunately, wine. No, unfortunately, even my imagination doesn't go so far. So it was all very well during the smooth years of globalization. You could produce things like BMWs, but in this more raw world that we are living in, we have to focus on the commanding heights or be relegated to second rate, and then we know what's going to happen. We're going to be pushed around. It's not a nice thing. So I think UE has a very advantageous position also with respect to the commanding heights, but they do need to be developed, I think. I think that there's scope to develop those further.
If my timekeeping is correct, we have at least 10 more minutes. I hope the audience is willing to put up with us because we have plenty of other questions around here, which all seem very interesting. One of them is a little bit critical when it comes again to the UAE, and that is the dollar peg, not just of the UAE, but of all the Gulf currencies, with the interaction between the US and China and the Gulf being in the middle. What is the future of the peg? Do you see any critical changes to it? Is it imminent? Is there still time to think about it? How do you picture those dynamics?
Yeah, but can I just address this? There is a problem with this, and I remember in the crisis 2008, people, including Greenspan, was enjoying the Gulf states to debeg from the dollar because they'll be losing. But one thing that Greenspan didn't pay attention to is our dollar exposure is very high. Our oil is nominated in dollars, and we have a lot of dollar resources. So whatever we will gain from debegging, if we have a basket of currency, we might be losing it because of the decline of the value of the amount of money we have accumulated through. So if we're going to do this, I think we have to do it in a slow process. That's one. The other geopolitical implication of debegging, by the way, one of the most important incidents of the U.S. power is the dollar. I mean, the dollar is, the United States can print as much as it wants as long as we nominate our prices of oil in dollars, right? So otherwise, then the value of dollars will decline. And I think this will be a red line for the United States. This will be a big rupture if they change their nominating their oil prices in yuan, let's say, or euro. So this will be a very big rupture between the. And I don't think the Gulf states, at least at this moment, are able to undertake such steps because the reaction will be very strong.
Creon, do you want to step in?
Yeah, I assume the dollar peg, as you have said, is kind of linked to the major export of the region being oil, which is priced in dollars. I mean, as the Gulf economies diversify, naturally you would expect that to be less critical, and there are ways of moving into a basket as a hook rather than something else. I mean, I think the broader question really is around the role of the dollar more generally in the global economy, and we saw, for example, in the case of Russia's attack on Ukraine, and the response from all the hard currency issuing currencies was similar in terms of freezing Russian central bank reserves and so on. And so at that time, if you were looking for an alternative for the dollar, there really wasn't one, because the political response was the same in all the hard currency countries. Nowadays, we are actually in a different position, because you could well imagine the US responding differently to such a situation to Europe. And in any case, Europe has been far more resistant when you look at issues like confiscating Russian central bank reserves. So one could be in a situation where there are attractions from other hard currencies, and that becomes an alternative to dollar. Whether beyond that you will get into a world where, if you like, stable coins linked to other currencies than the dollar become attractive and so on, I'm more skeptical. But the desire from the wider world to move away from the dollar is actually really strong. It's just that there isn't an obvious alternative at the moment.
I think we talk about de-dollarization quite a bit, especially it's happened, when bond yields were going in the wrong direction in the US. But my sense is that we're at about, 90% of transactions globally are dollar denominated. I know that China has reduced its kind of holdings of US treasuries over time, and as has Japan to some extent. But I mean, everybody's been scratching their heads to figure out if there is a credible alternative. I think you spoke about the euro. I mean, I wouldn't mind holding euros myself, but I think overall, it's still going to be quite some time before a credible alternative emerges. I think President Trump has done some damage to the dollar. The others are not in a hurry to do damage to the dollar, I think. So that's why if people are worried about the peg in that context, I don't think anything major is going to change in the foreseeable future. Maybe in a decade or so. I mean, if others step up in a credible way, I don't see how the euro steps up in a credible way without a good defense kind of a security blanket, which it cannot offer right now. It needs a security blanket itself. And I don't see China. Euro could be, but the Europeans have to do a lot more, especially on defense, to be able to make it a credible alternative.
Thank you very much. I think we can wrap it up by saying that nothing is settled, that we should have that conversation a year from now again and see where we stand. And in all likelihood, nothing will be settled still, probably. But thank you very much for the very lovely insights. I think we learned a lot, and we got all sorts of different perspectives to think about. So thank you all for this wonderful session, and looking forward to meeting you again in Abu Dhabi.
Thank you so much.